The road to the American Revolution was long and a test of strength for those who lived in the 13 colonies. Many events led to the colonists to unite as a nation and free themselves from the unfair rule of the British Parliament, but more importantly, to free themselves of the rule of the King of Great Britain, George III. The problems for the colonists started after the French and Indian War was over between the British against the French and the Indians. Once the war was over, the British ended up taking power over the land in North America that had previously been owned by the French. The British Parliament and King issued the Proclamation Act of 1763 to settle claims over the new English territory. This act settled the Appalachian Mountains as a border between the colonies and the West. The act angered the colonists because they were not able to expand west and progress economically, which they knew was exactly what the British wanted. Not only did the French and Indian War leave Britain with new territory in North America, but it also forced the British Parliament to borrow large amounts of money, and once the war was over, they had to find a way to pay back all the debt. Even though the colonists were not involved in the war and gained nothing from it, the British Treasurer George Grenville decided that the Sugar Act would be passed in the colonies. The Sugar Act raised taxes on imported sugar and molasses. The taxes were paid by colonial merchants, but while this was the purpose, many of them smuggled and, if caught, were given penalties that violated due process of law. The merchants were instantly found guilty without evidence, and their cargo was seized without warrant. This caused the colonist merchants to feel used and angry. The animosity between colonists and the British only worsened from here on, as the colonists kept on being taxed heavily for a war that they had no part in. The Stamp Act was the first direct tax on the colonists. The amount of taxes the British were placing on the colonists started to worry them, and they questioned how far they would go. Furthermore, the colonists protested because while they were heavily taxed for the convenience of Great Britain, there was no representation for them in Parliament. The Stamp Act was eventually repealed, but the British still wanted to prove their power over the colonies. To show this, the Declaratory Act was issued as Britain's reaction to colonists' hate toward British rule. The colonists further expressed their opposition with the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty was a secret organization that attacked Loyalists. Loyalists were people who still supported the rule of the British king. The Sons of Liberty usually took tar and feathers and dumped them on Loyalists to make their point about their opposition to the British rule. After the Declaratory Act, Parliament decided to pass the Townshend Acts as well. Taxes were placed on popular items such as lead, glass, paper, paint, and tea. The colonists were shocked that the British went so far, so they decided to come together and form the Non-Importation Agreement. With this agreement, the colonists had agreed to not take any imports from the British. The colonists had, for the first time, agreed to do something together to protest the British policies. Now that the colonists had come together and shown that they could stand up for themselves, they were not afraid to do the same during the Boston Tea Party. This event of colonists throwing tea into the harbor started with the British East India Company decided to sell their tea for less. Colonial merchants became angry because this would put them out of business. The colonist merchants decided to take revenge by taking the tea off a British ship and dumping it into Boston Harbor. The British refused to be treated like that by the colonists, so they issued the Intolerable Acts, otherwise known as the Coercive Acts in Britain. Through this act, the colonists were punished as the port was closed. After the colonists saw that the British were being brutal and wouldn't give them their freedom easily, the colonists decided to take action. 12 of the colonies, except Georgia, came together in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. In this meeting, the colonies came together and shared ideas about the British conflicts. They agreed to cease all trade with Great Britain. While the meeting was productive, the colonies had not yet come together to fight as a united nation. These were just hints of the future struggle that would require them to come together and fight the British as one. As the colonists were already on edge because of the British acts of force, the colony of Massachusetts decided to be prepared and collected military supplies in a small town called Concord, just outside of Boston. The British Parliament heard of these events and decided to stop the colonists. The colonists heard that the British were coming, and when they reached Lexington, 70 American Minutemen were waiting. These events are today known as the Battles of Lexington and Concord. Furthermore, this was the start of the war in the American Revolution. The colonists were unfairly taxed and forced to the extreme by the British, and they had no choice but to come together and protect their home during war. They decided to take the matter of their freedom and government into their own hands, instead of leaving it to a country that was a whole ocean away and had no consideration. That was the road to the American Revolution.